This question asks, how do you train a dog who isn't food motivated, or in my dog's case, isn't motivated by their HP treats that taste pretty blah, apparently? So this is a really great question and a common concern that folks have when they perceive that their dog isn't especially interested in food. So let's tackle these questions one at a time. First up, how do you train a dog who isn't food motivated? And this is actually a bit of a trick question because all dogs are food motivated in the sense that they need food to live. But if you have a dog who frequently turns down food or is often disinterested in food, that itself is actually sort of a red flag. And it's one of the things in our behavior therapy plan that we need to address up front. There are a myriad of reasons that a dog might not be taking food. The most common one that I see is the dog does not take food when they are distressed. Their stress levels are too high. And for my client population who is experiencing chronic dysregulation, chronic stress, they have anxiety disorders, trauma, hyper or hypoarousal, they're chronically stressed by their environment. This can be a tricky one to sometimes differentiate because we say, well, the dog is never interested in food, but the reason the dog is never really interested in food is because they are chronically stressed. So that digestive system is not working at full capacity. You don't need to eat food while you're being chased by a lion. And if the nervous system is kind of chronically more elevated, more on alert, more in that sympathetic nervous system than we would like, we can see that disinterest in food and mistake it for the dog's personality. Or we might see that in the contexts that we are trying to get the dog to take food and really taking note, it's really salient to us that the dog won't, is in proximity to their triggers, things that they are stressed about. And sometimes that's just being outside the house or just being inside the house or just being in proximity to the trigger. And part of my job as a behavior consultant is to help clients break down their criteria more finely than they thought possible. So if we have a dog who is so stressed that they're not taking food, even at the least exposure to the trigger that the client can imagine, part of my job is to help break down that exposure even more finely. But there are other reasons too that a dog might not be taking food other than stress. Certainly there is a high comorbidity between GI issues and chronic stress. And that is because the GI system is a stress system. And this is becoming more and more and more clear as we learn more about the GI system of humans and in dogs. And so especially when we have chronic nervous system dysregulation, we can see that we have chronic GI issues. And we also see a high comorbidity with allergies. And again, that's because the immune system isn't functioning as well as we would like because you don't need to fight off a cold when you're being chased by a lion either. So there's a high comorbidity between chronic stress and health concerns, especially around the GI system or allergies, which can both impact the dog's interest or perceived interest in food. Another really common reason is that the food has been poisoned, and that's not literally poisoned, but it can be that the dog predicts bad things when the food appears. So we have accidentally taught the dog that instead of the scary thing meaning food is coming and changing that, counter conditioning that negative response to a neutral or positive one, we've actually taught the dog that food means a scary thing is coming and created a negative association with the food. And this can mean anything from, oh man, they start reaching for treats when a trigger is coming, to food having been used coercively to put the dog in situations that they truly aren't ready for, but they were interested in food, and so they ended up in those situations, and now that food predicts that they are going to be in over their head and they avoid it. So these are just a few of the most common reasons that I see that a dog might not be interested in food. And they are all things that we need to address so that we can use food effectively in our behavior therapy. It's certainly not our only tool, but it is a really common and easily accessible one that we want to use quite a bit. When we have dogs who have allergies or they have big dietary restrictions, we have to get creative with the food that they can have. This is often done in conjunction with the veterinarian or a veterinary nutritionist. Sometimes it's saying, okay, maybe we can use the wet version of the prescription food that you're on. Or maybe there are, HP diets from different brands, and maybe the dog prefers one brand over the other. Sometimes, depending on what we're working with, we can use other food sources to sort of increase the value of that food, whether it's the wet or dry version. It depends on what the dog's specific restrictions are. But sometimes we can do things like use the dust from like a freeze-dried single ingredient protein, if the dog is allowed to have that protein, and we can up the value of their kibbles with some of that dust. If the dog can have like some Parmesan cheese dust over their kibbles, that can up the value. If it's safe to marinate the kibbles in like a Ziploc bag or a Tupperware container with some meat, and perhaps, depending again on things, not actually feed the dog the meat, but now we have that sort of flavor and scent as part of that, we can increase the value that way. But a lot of this is going to be highly individualized depending on what restrictions the dog has. So a basic good rule that I think would apply to most dogs is going to be, is there a wet food version of what we're feeding that they can have? And playing with different brands of the same formula. So in conclusion, food is not the end-all be-all to behavior therapy, but not being able to use food effectively can be a bit of a red flag to other underlying issues that are probably much bigger and really affect the dog's well-being, and that's going to affect our success. Plus, it is a really accessible, typically way that we can help create new emotions, we can help the dog calm, we can use it as management, and so having that available really does help us in creating our behavior therapy plans.